the First Nations assume that all of these entities won't talk to them, and vice versa. First Nations, really controversial topics. Once you get them sitting across the room from each other and talking to each other, it dispels a lot of what their assumptions were. And that's the key. Even though you think it's going to be controversial, it's better than the hearsay and it never getting resolved or going anywhere, because it goes in circles forever unless you sit down and
Clint is concerned that the mistrust of government orders is smoldering into a dangerous situation.
People that left, obviously are not going to leave next time. And some of those people that have told me that I'm going to stay and we're not, they're people that should leave. Like in Australia, they had actual, you had to take certain firefighting courses to be able to stay and defend your own property. I don't see that being a bad idea. People shouldn't just be allowed to stay and fight fire if they don't know what they're doing. But who am I to tell them that they can't protect their own property? Because I protected my property. because I stayed and protected my property.
Flint acknowledges that the BC Wildfire Service has its own rules and priorities that it needs to follow.
Like I said, we've done everything by the book. So now we have to change the rules in the book. In the past, these fires have been away from communities. Now that they're on top of communities, the forestry is going to have to come up with a different way of dealing with or fighting or working with the community to put it out.
Are we going to just keep doing what we're doing and hope that it gets better? Or do we try something different?
And so, to find out what we should be doing differently, we went to one of the most outspoken forest scientists in the province.
Yeah, so my name is Laurie Daniels. I am a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia, and I run the tree ring lab in the Forest and Conservation Sciences Department.
As you might already know, tree rings can tell us much more than just how old a tree lived to be.
And we describe it as reading between the lines.
Scars embedded in tree rings can tell us stories of insect damage, windstorms, cultural modifications, and, of course, fire.
The forest fires come in a whole bunch of types and sizes and severities. So a very intense forest fire that's burning from treetop to treetop, which is called a crown fire, it actually does a lot of damage to the trees, and the majority of the trees are killed. But you can also have forest fires that are burning down along the surface of the ground. So they're burning the plants and the vegetation on the surface. They're burning around the trunks of the trees, but not necessarily spreading the flames up into the tops of the trees. So if the heat of that fire is intense enough, it can cause damage to the trunk of the tree without actually killing it. And so it's that heat, it damages it, and yet other parts of the tree survive. So it begins to form what we call a scar. Now, some of the trees in our interior dry forests here in British Columbia have really thick bark, and they're adapted to those surface fires. And so an individual tree can survive multiple surface fires in its life. We often find trees that have anywhere from 5 to 12 fire scars on them. And our record is a ponderosa pine that has over 40 fire scars embedded in a single tree.
That tree lived to be over 500 years old, with surface fires regularly toasting its bark, at least every 8 to 9 years. If any of those fires had become a crown fire, that tree would never have lived through the centuries.
But in the age of industrial forestry, it's those same surface fires that have been suppressed.
They're the ones that we have very, very effectively put out. So we've virtually eliminated them from the forests, which mean in absence of surface fires, all the small trees have grown in to form ladder fuels. The forests are much more dense, and you've accumulated needles and leaves and branches and woody debris over many decades. So the fuel loads are really high. And so ironically, the places that are most fire prone in terms of weather and climate are also the places that have these really dense forests and accumulated fuels.
To recap for new listeners, ladder fuels, as Laurie mentioned, are exactly how they sound. It's tricky for a fire to go from the ground up to the canopy, unless, of course, it has something to climb on. First shrubs, onto young trees, and then further up branches and into the crown.
Which makes intuitive sense. If you've ever built a campfire, especially if you were using a bow drill, big logs don't tend to catch sparks until there's a lot of smaller stuff already burning. By suppressing surface fires, we've effectively stockpiled our forests with just the
We're
right...
not burning through fuels that are natural ecosystems. They're burning at high intensity through altered fuels, fuels that have been altered by fire suppression, through insect outbreaks that have exceeded their unprecedented in their size and severity, and are leaving behind fuels through our management, through our salvage responses, that are also unusual. And so the fires that we're experiencing that are of such high intensity and severity, I don't think those are typical of the fires that burned historically in these landscapes. We have such a tremendous diversity of ecosystem types, and associated with them the wide range of historical and contemporary fire regimes, that it makes trying to come up with a solution that's one size fits all absolutely impossible.
This is always the challenge with complex ecological systems. It's dangerous to draw generalizations from them. And to be honest, for us podcasters, it's this reality that keeps us up at night. But there are a few principles that apply no matter where you are. Chief among them is that proactive solutions are the best way to safeguard communities against destruction.
And really, we need to be looking beyond the wildland-urban interface, beyond the 2-kilometer buffer between forests and communities. We need to rethink how we manage forest lands in general.
There's a choice then for us to use a technique called managed wildfire. So when fires ignite in places where they don't put homes and lives at risk, and when they're burning under fire weather conditions that are unlikely to produce a conflagration that we cannot stop, then those fires can be left to burn on the landscape. There will always be fires, a subset of fires that we have to suppress because they put lives and homes and critical infrastructure at risk. And so we will choose to suppress those. And those are often the areas where we also need to then be thinking about actively managing the vegetation to reduce fuel hazards and to reduce the risk of fire either igniting and spreading from those areas or spreading into those areas. So those are going to be our kind of active, proactive fire management zones, and where hopefully people will also take the responsibility to fire smart their homes and properties simultaneously.
Beyond just allowing certain wildfires to burn, there's a need to return prescribed fire to the land, where appropriate.
I think that as people become better informed, they might be more accepting of prescribed burns as a type of management tool. The ecological principles that we're founding our management on are outdated. There have been entire paradigm shifts in ecological theory and in our understanding of disturbance and the role of change and environmental change and climate and the way ecosystems function within that context over the past 20 to 30 years. And yet the foundational systems, the management systems, the classification systems, the management paradigms that we are employing are based on pre-1970s ecosystem theory. And we're living the consequences of that.
Consequences that, of course, include massive carbon emissions from massive wildfires. For me, the role of wildfires in forested ecosystems is one of the major canaries in the carbon coal mine.
Carbon coal mine seems a little bit.
And on the subject of carbon, Lori told us something that we were shocked to learn.
When we do our carbon accounting, and as we report both nationally and to the international community, wildfires do not count. They are not considered a source of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we have to account for when we do our carbon budgets.
But, strangely, prescribed burning is factored in. It just doesn't seem like an honest way to present the facts, or incentivize corrective action. Last year, wildfire emissions tripled the combined output of human activity in BC.
The report that came from the Canadian Forest Service then is if you take into account the carbon being emitted by forest fires and by insects like mountain pine beetle and defoliators like eastern and western spruce cutworm, our forests in Canada have been net emitters of carbon. We have been sources of carbon as opposed to sinks since the year 2001.
I'm just going to let that sink in for a minute. What Lori is saying is that Canada's boreal forests have actually released more carbon than they've taken in over the past 2 decades. And I don't know about you, but that gives me a huge sinking feeling. Like smashing that piggy bank that you've been saving for a rainy day and finding nothing in it but ashes. Wildfires play a major role in this dynamic, but going from 100 years of suppressing fire in order to protect assets and then suppressing fire to prevent carbon emissions, that just isn't going to work. We needed some perspective on this, so we called up someone who works with fire in the boreal forest every day.
I personally have challenges with discussions around changing climate and carbon sequestration because I do believe that it all depends on your temporal and spatial scale. When the discussion comes around wildland fires and prescribed fires emitting carbon, I would suggest that we don't only think about carbon emission or carbon source or carbon sink at time zero. I'm a firm believer that we need to be thinking about time since fire. And in my brain and in my schooling and my opinion and what I write about, time since fire is not only when the flaming is happening and the combustion is happening and smoke is going into the air, but 2 months later, as the vegetation is starting to regrow and potentially put carbon back into the ground, and then perhaps a month later, when an animal comes along and browses and grazes on that vegetation. So that's just in a short time since fire. So when I hear people talking about changing climate and interaction with carbon sequestration, my question is often, well, what's the time scale and what's the space scale that we're discussing? Because it's not always going to be black, and it's not always going to be smoking.
Meet Sonia. We couldn't make it all the way up north to Fort Nelson, so she got a chair and a microphone at her local radio station, and we called her up.
I'm Dr. Sonia Leverkus. I have a PhD in natural resource ecology and management with a specialization in pyroherbivory and landscape ecology.
Sonia's fire credentials don't end there. She has an ecological consulting firm, as well as a hands-on wildfire management, prescribed burning, and wildfire fighting company, where she serves as an ignition specialist. She's certified as a wildland fire practitioner, and besides that, she's a registered professional biologist, professional agrologist, a forester in training, and an adjunct professor at the University of Alberta.
In other words, in the world of prescribed fire, Sonia is involved at every level.
I do everything from writing and developing prescribed fire burn plans to prescribed fire strategies. I also teach fire courses. I'm a certified BC Wildfire Service instructor, and I have developed a series of prescribed fire schools along with my colleagues from Oklahoma State University. And our team teaches people about prescribed fire. We do a hands-on approach, so we learn in the classroom, and then we also go out into the field and do prescribed fires together.
Once we had a sense of Sonia's seemingly limitless energy for practicing burning and fire advocacy, we wanted to take the temperature of prescribed fire in BC.
There are many people who talk about prescribed fire, but there are very few of us who are willing, dedicated, and able to actually put fire on the land. I would say that prescribed fire is consistently brought forward in various discussions at various levels in the government, in non-government, throughout the province and the country. But I would also say there's many challenges associated with implementing prescribed fire in this province. I think that one of the great challenges, and this speaks to government and the public and society as a whole, is this lack of acceptance and understanding of the important role that not only the role that fire has on the land, but that fire is a natural process, an ecological process that is very important to many different species. I think that there's also one of the challenges is the lack of understanding of that critical interaction between fire and ecological disturbances. So a lot of my education and specialization is in pyrrhic herbivory, and that's the fire-grazing interaction. So how fire across the landscape is important for different herbivores, but even more than that, having a shifting mosaic, so a distribution of time since fire across a broad landscape is very, very important for biodiversity, and that shifting mosaic is kind of like a patchwork where we see recent fire across the land and longer time since fire across the land, and different animals and different values require this varying spatial temporal distribution of fire across the land. And I think that is something that's very important for the public and our decision makers to understand.
This idea of a shifting mosaic is exactly what we've ignored under our conventional forest management. The type of forestry we're used to could be called static management. The boundaries between woodlots, old growth management areas, and parks and recreation, they're all fixed. And we try to prevent any kind of disturbance which could interrupt our master plan.
Natural forests, the forests that all wildlife evolved alongside, the forests that we need if we're going to become truly wildfire resilient. Those forests have patches of trees of different ages and different densities. And not only is the forest patchy, the patches themselves vary widely in size and distribution.
And, most importantly, they change. We wanted to learn more about how we might create these shifting mosaics, so we headed south to eastern Washington, positively tropical by Canadian standards.
I'm Paul Hesper. I'm a forester and research landscape ecologist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service. I'm a part of the Pacific Northwest Research Station. We have labs throughout Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, and I work in a lab in eastern Washington, the town of Wenatchee.
Wenatchee is a beautiful town on the eastern foothills of the Cascades, surrounded by orchards. In the aftermath of major wildfires up and down the coast, there have been a bewildering number of sometimes conflicting prognoses delivered by different scientists through a not always scientifically literate media. Paul has studied fire-prone landscapes for over 40 years, and he is able to deftly situate the elements that drive them.
The science is really clear that regardless of geography, the area that's burned is driven by the changing climate. So area burned annually is driven, and its increase correlates beautifully with the signature of the climate in each geographic area. The severity of fire is driven by an interaction between fuels and the climate. You need fuels for energy, really, so severity has to tie to fuels. And we know that it does, but it does so in a variable way by geographic area.
I think this distinction between area burned and burn severity is really useful. With climate setting the menu, it's really not a question of whether or not we'll be having fire. It's how we want that fire served.
But fire severity is driven by this nexus of how the fuel commingles and interacts with the particular climate that's going on. And it's the only variable in the equation that we can actually do something about. We actually have the opportunity to manage that particular variable, and we can do it intelligently.
We've already discussed some of our management practices, which are well established and widely employed. The biggest disagreements arise when we try to decide where, when, and how they should be employed at a landscape scale. And at serious risk of redundancy, the biggest pitfall we've encountered is assuming that what works in one place will necessarily work in another.
If you hear a one-size-fits-all answer, be instantly suspicious about it.
That being said, we are now about to make some broad generalizations.
Not generalizations, Adam. Principles. Paul brought together a consortium of scientists who are leaders in their areas to create what he calls a co-managed, co-rendering of the science.
We basically said, can we go through the literature together and synthesize hundreds of research articles that give us some insight on a short list of things that if we do them would move us onto solid ground. There's a lot more principles that we could write, but it's hard to keep them in RAM. So what does a short list look like, right?
You know, Mendel, lately I've been really feeling like I need a RAM upgrade to keep up with everything.
Yeah,
You have something there?
oh yeah.
Check it in.
Principle 1. Landscapes, they're hierarchical. They're like nested Russian dolls. There's a very broad scale regional landscape, and regional landscapes differ one to another. So there isn't a recipe about what hierarchies look like from one geographic area to another. But we notice that every area has them.
The first principle is all about scale. Different ecological patterns and processes operate at different scales. For example, biogeoclimatic zone, subzone, and variant here in BC. Management actions should be tailored to the appropriate scale. Also, the scales are connected by both bottom-up and top-down forces. What we do at one scale will have ripple effects throughout the system.
If you want to restore forests in any place, you have to be thinking about at least 3 levels. What we do at one level influences pattern and process at the next level. Principle 2. The second principle is that if we want to know how to tailor patterns back to the landscape, what is a simple template that we can use? Well, it's topography. If you look at a map of topography, with north and south aspects, ridge tops and valley bottoms, when I superimpose that on a terrain model, I can literally see in exquisite detail how topography and the map of soils and the map of land surface waters influenced the productivity and the growth of forest, the kind of forest, and the fire regime of forest.
We got into an extended conversation with Paul about this principle, because while topography can provide an excellent template to guide restoration, its effects vary from region to region. Suffice it to say that in Paul's region, south-facing slopes mean open, low-density forest and frequent fires, while north-facing slopes feature denser forests and less frequent, higher-intensity fires. That might be true where you live, or it might not. The template itself will change, but the principle of topography as a template is a constant.
Principle 3. The third principle is that wildfire is not only an essential process, but it's the engine of the system. You not only can't take it out, it's really important and super clever to keep it in the system, but in the right way. And what drives wildfire? That's patterns of non-forest and how they interact with forest successional patterns over space and time. So that's the fuel that drives the engine.
The third principle states that disturbance and succession drive ecosystem change. If disturbance, in this case wildfire, is the engine, and forest landscapes in various stages of succession are the fuel, then we should focus on either allowing wildfire to restore healthy successional patterns or to restore them ourselves. Right now, humans are A, if not the primary driver of ecosystem change, and something of a drunk driver at that. To step out of that role, we need to work with and not against natural disturbances.
Principle 4. The fourth principle is that wildfires over space and time produce severity in what we call patch size distributions. And from studying lots of fires, we found that most of the historical fires were small to medium size. So what's the role of the small fire? Well, it's to recomplexify the landscape burned by large fires. And that's what we see. Small and medium-sized fires historically blocked fire flow under all but the most extreme fire weather. And under the most extreme weather, the large fires occurred and they reduced complexity. Inside of a large fire, it's not all high severity. In the native regime, it's this incredibly complicated patchwork of low mixed in high severity fire, but it was a big event. It was varied because the other fires were constantly reducing fuel, so you didn't get one severity signature out of this event. You got this incredible mix. So we don't manage the frequency of the large patches, we manage the frequency of the small and medium-sized patches. they manage the frequency of the larger patches.
You could spend hours talking with Paul about patch size distributions, and we literally did. The main takeaway from the fourth principle is that the relative proportion and distribution of differently sized forest patches is an emergent property of a given fire regime. Our problems start when we cause landscapes to deviate from that pattern, so learning to recognize a region's appropriate patch size distribution is key.
Principle 5. The fifth principle is that logging took the large and the old trees, and they were climate and wildfire tolerant, and they were a phenomenal genetic legacy. If they survive tremendously well, they're also a great way to store genes, right? So keep what you have and make more of them, and these are in the fire tolerant species.
Principle 5, keep those big trees alive. In open forests, older trees can survive low-intensity fires and provide an essential seed source for regeneration. In the artificially dense forests created by fire suppression, older trees sometimes need our help to clear accumulated woody debris and fire ladders that put them at risk. Either way, respect your elders.
And leave room for alders. That's principle 5 3/4. Honest.
Principle 6. Sixth principle. It's one of my favorites. Patches are really landscapes unto themselves. They're the finest scale landscape in our Russian doll analogy. Trees naturally regenerate in clumps and gaps. And as it turns out, that's highly influential to creating very fine scale habitats for species that live in a small area, but it also changes the way fire behaves at that finest scale. And how it behaves at that finer scale influences how a fire can actually move through a local landscape. So, how we manage the clumpiness of trees and the gap sizes is important to building a local landscape that's high functioning.
The key to understanding principle 6 is that even at a small scale, forest patches aren't homogeneous. They consist of clumps of trees of different ages, with small or large gaps in between. If you've ever walked in a forest that wasn't planted by people, you understand this intuitively. But it's easy to forget to preserve this fine-scale heterogeneity when you're restoring landscape at scale. Just remember.
It's clumps and gaps, baby. Principle 7. The seventh principle, it's actually not that hard. It's really intuitive. When European settlers crossed into the West, we sliced and diced the ecological landscape into land ownership lines. That was the ethos in those days. What does that mean if we want to get good ecological functioning? We actually have to work together across ownerships to be able to restore ecological conditions that make sense for all of us. And what's interesting, we're learning through our collaboratives, is that people want to work together. They have wanted for decades to work together, and so when we do, it's not easy. We have different goals, we have different values, but we enter into a discussion about how we compromise, how we get what we need and give the landscape what it needs, and through jointly looking at the data about what the landscape is, how it changed, and what we need, we start to understand what our piece of the puzzle is, what each of us need to do.
The seventh principle represents perhaps the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity we face in this paradigm shift we've been discussing. And it brings us right back to where we started, to partnerships. The existing gridlock of property lines and politics can feel like a concrete reality, but these are human conventions and are, therefore, subject to change.
So the collaborative environment is people coming together, saying what they want, saying what they value, developing a common language for understanding the landscape, for talking to each other, and then, one by one, putting aside old mistrust. I would say most of what drives difficulties between some managers and NGOs who patently disagree with them is deep veins of mistrust, broken relationships, broken promises. And healing those is a deeply personal and incredibly important social need. And it has to happen before you can bring people together and develop common solutions and go forward. What that means is people have got to put aside their old hurts and their mistrust and develop a common way forward, common ownership in what the plan is.
But even once we gather around the table, it's becoming easier, with our newfound powers, to imagine that we can just sit down, look at some maps, and decide which patches should go where, and how the landscape should look in 2 and 3 dimensions. But it's critical that we remember the 4th dimension: time.
Maps lie. Maps that come out of sophisticated GISs lie. They persuade us that what we just mapped can be permanent, and there is no permanence. The ideas that come out of the 7 principles are that what you want to do is generate the patterns and the characteristics of landscapes that are constantly being nudged and thrown around. And they're thrown around differently when you're working with the operating rules of that particular system. Adopting the 7 principles is not essentially raising the level of your craft so now you're perfect at engineering a landscape. It's actually saying, we think the landscape wants to work in this way, get somewhere within the wobble of that system, and then allow wildfires and climate to continually nudge it.
We'd like to take you on one last stop. We're headed to Alkali Lake, to the Eskedem First Nation, a community that is diving confidently back into the water. The issues of community autonomy and of First Nations leadership and shifting mosaics that we've been discussing, the community of Alkali Lake is bringing it all together.
Alkali Lake is about an hour south of Williams Lake.
Or longer if you happen to be taking the unpaved road real easy on your compact rental car.
And as you're driving, all of a sudden, after the crest of a hill, the road opens into a stunning valley, and the landscape changes completely. The sculpted hills were green from this unusually rainy summer. Trees pepper the valley walls, but, as we learned, they've only appeared in the age of fire suppression.
This landscape change occurs because, as you enter Alkali Lake, you are entering one of the little fingers of the northernmost extent of the bunchgrass biogeoclimatic zone, one of the rarest biogeoclimatic zones in BC, actually covering less than 1% of the province, but home to a stunning array of biodiversity. Also, very fire-prone ecosystem. It was a drizzly gray morning, and we arrived in what first looked like a quaint Old West-style one-horse town, only then to find a whole team of horses keeping dry under the roof of the gas station, and a brand new biomass thermal plant running on wood chips. On the hillside nearest the town, not more than 100 meters from the closest building, a burn pile was already well underway, and the sound of chainsaws echoed from the trees.
We pulled up to the arm and offices. That's Alkali Lake Resource Management, where we met Francis Johnson.
Yeah, my traditional name is Equinimesk, and it's a subsequent name that I've been given, and I'm also a hereditary chief, one of 3 in the community, and I'm also a professional forester. I work with Alkali Resource Management here in strategic planning.
The fact that Francis holds this role of hereditary chief is a sign of the times, of the declaration of the rights and title of the Eskedem First Nation, and the recent revival of traditional governance.
Yeah, in May 8th in 2017, after the Chilcotin case victory, we thought that the group of us would get together and work out the hunting piece. We thought we were just picking off a little piece of it, but it turned out to manage the deer, you had to manage the grass, you had to manage the water, and then it turned into managing the land. So we came up with reinstating our traditional governance. So it's called the Equimindum de Tumis Eskedem. It means looking after the land of the White people. We've learned so much about our culture, the language, and yeah, it's all coming back really nicely.
Eskedem First Nation is matriarchal, like all sane societies. The Council of Grandmothers basically runs the show.
And that council appoints the chiefs, who represent the family roots, as well as a series of expert headmen, each with a different role and responsibility. There's a different headman to manage fishing, berries, ceremony, and of course, fire.
All of the important things in life.
A headman uses both a spiritual connection with the land and the expertise gained by the natural natural science of observation to administer his duty. The new fire headman is Darren Stanislaus. He and Francis both serve a dual role as part of their traditional governance as well as managing the forestry of Arm.
As a timber-savvy community, the people of Alkali Lake are passionate about fire, and they're leading the way in re-establishing its use as a management technique.
And in his role of planning when and how to intervene with the ecosystem, Francis has a clear mandate.
As a First Nations people, we feel we have the right and we're tasked with managing the land for 7 generations in the future. And every decision we make, we have to keep that in mind. It has to be sustainable for all our kids. We're just pouring the land from our children.
Not only their children, but all the descendants they'll never get to meet. It's a perspective that forces you to consider your cumulative long-term impacts.
And we're lucky that memory of local burning still lives on. Skedam community members were burning their grasslands as late as the 1950s. Since those times, stories of the qualitative changes to the ecosystem are both a warning of how bad things have become and a guide for the path ahead.
Our elders say that we used to be able to ride horseback freely and gallop through stands. Now they're so ingrown that you can't chase horses in the area anymore. So that's definitely an indicator that we've listened to our elders where 100 years ago there were no trees in this valley because of frequent fire. It was maintained every year or two for grass burning.
And now, that practice is finally coming back.
Traditionally on reserve, we do burn yearly on this main village to protect the houses. We are a fire smart community, so that is some of the work that we do to maintain our safety.
These would have been traditionally burned on a 13 to 17 year interval to keep their hands are tied when it comes to old growth management areas. They can't enter the area with machinery, with the exception of dealing with pine beetle infestation. But on the other hand, any fuel treatment they do at scale should be able to pay for itself, likely by harvesting the smaller trees.
Which makes this seem like an especially delicate situation.
Gotta have fire,
And then, just like with Clint in Southside, we hopped in a truck and got taken on a tour of the local burns. Except this time, the burns we saw weren't from wildfire. We drove up the hill beside the ARM office and stopped by a pile of branches, burning happily.
Yeah, so the prescription is about 9 feet up with pruning and we are piling and burning. So, and also we have spacing for the stands. Just when we get on top, you'll see it. But this is directly adjacent to the village, which is a little bit higher risk. So we got funding from the government to treat this area.
Right. Would you broadcast burn here?
Yeah, that's the thinking. We're gonna, in the future, maybe a year or two, burn from the grassland up into these forests to try and emulate like a natural.
Safely start to burn up into these areas.
Yeah.
This was all part of a manual fuel mitigation project, funded by the Strategic Wildfire Prevention Initiative, or SWIPE, crewed by students and developed